Some people walk into your life quietly and rearrange everything. The first time I stood on the porch of that old craftsman house on Elmwood Avenue, I was 22 years old, holding a six-pack of soda and wearing mismatched socks. My best friend Danny had forgotten his keys again and told me to meet him there after his shift. I remember the way the late September light fell golden and heavy through the maple trees that lined the street, the leaves just beginning to surrender their green for something more honest, something the color of rust and fire. I knocked, and the door, that beautiful, faded blue door, swung open. And there he was. Julian Mercer stood in the doorway of his own home like he had always belonged in doorways, like he was made specifically to fill the spaces between inside and outside, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that told stories before his mouth ever opened, calloused at the palms, steady, deliberate. He had silver threading through dark hair at his temples, and eyes the deep, quiet brown of river water after rain. He wore a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up, and there was a smear of wood stain on his left forearm. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Then he smiled. "You must be Liam," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't fight for space in a room, it simply occupied it. "Danny said you'd be stopping by. Come in, I just made coffee." That was it. That was the whole beginning. No thunderclap, no dramatic score swelling in the background, just a blue door, a tired golden afternoon, and a man who said my name like he'd known it for years. I stepped inside, and I couldn't have known that I was walking into the most life-changing moment of my existence. "My name is Liam Cole, and I want to tell you a story about love. Not the easy kind, not the kind they write pop songs about or sell in greeting cards. I want to tell you about the kind of love that sneaks up on you sideways, the kind that you don't recognize until you're already standing waist-deep in it, the kind that asks you to be braver than you ever thought you could be." I grew up in a small city in the Pacific Northwest where the rain is a personality rather than a weather pattern. I had a modest upbringing, a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to read to me every night, and a deep chronic loneliness that I had learned to dress up in humor so that nobody would notice it. I was the funny one in every room, the one who deflected every real question with a joke, who filled silence with noise because silence asked too many things of me. Danny Mercer had been my best friend since our sophomore year of college, when we were both assigned to the same dreadful 8 a.m. philosophy lecture and silently bonded over our shared suffering. He was easy to be around, loud where I was quiet underneath my jokes, careless where I was overthinking everything, free in a way I always envied. We were opposites who had decided, somewhere along the way, to become necessary to each other. But I had never been to his childhood home before. He and his dad had a complicated relationship, not hostile, just distant in the particular way that two people who love each other deeply but speak entirely different emotional languages sometimes become distant. Danny processed everything out loud in motion through laughter and noise. Julian processed everything inward, through woodworking and long silences and books stacked on every available surface. I learned all of this slowly, in pieces, the way you learn anything that truly matters. The inside of Julian's house was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was warm the way that spaces become when a single person tends to them with quiet, consistent care over many years. Books everywhere, real books, worn and annotated, organized not by color for aesthetics but in some personal system that only he understood. A half-finished wooden chair in the corner of the living room, sawdust still faintly in the air. A record player on a shelf, an LP already resting on the turntable. A kitchen that smelled of dark roast coffee and something herbal, rosemary or thyme. He handed me a mug without asking how I took it, black, which was exactly right, and nodded toward the breakfast bar. "Danny texted," he said, settling back against the kitchen counter with his own mug. "He's running about 40 minutes late, something about his manager needing him to close." "Of course," I said and laughed, and the laugh came out more genuine than I expected. Classic Danny. Julian smiled at that. Not a big smile, everything about him was measured, economical, but real, deeply real. He's always been that way since he was 8 years old. I used to pick him up from school and he'd come running out 45 minutes after the bell, some elaborate explanation ready. Lost track of time, found a caterpillar, convinced his teacher to let him reorganize the art supply cabinet. "That is so completely Danny," I said, and something happened in the space between us then, a small warmth, a recognition. We were two people who loved the same complicated, wonderful, exhausting person, and that was a kind of instant bond. We talked for those 40 minutes. I don't know how to explain what that conversation felt like except to say it felt like the opposite of small talk. We covered things, real things. He asked me what I studied, architecture with a minor in creative writing, a combination that confused most people, and instead of the usual polite nod, he actually wanted to know why. What drew me to the intersection of structure and story. I told him about my mother, about growing up in small apartments and always being fascinated by the way a room could change a person's mood, could make you feel held or forgotten depending on the ceiling height and the quality of the light. He listened. He actually listened, not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the way a person listens when what you're saying genuinely matters to them. "You're describing architecture as empathy," he said quietly. I stared at him. In 4 years of school, no professor had ever distilled it so cleanly. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what I mean." He nodded slowly, looking at his coffee. "I feel that way about woodworking sometimes. Every piece of furniture is a quiet argument about how a human body should feel when it rests." Danny arrived 43 minutes later, blowing through the blue door with his jacket half on and an apology on his lips before he'd even fully entered. He found us at the kitchen counter, deep in a conversation about the emotional architecture of porches, the way a porch is neither inside nor outside, neither private nor public, and what that threshold space means to the people who inhabit it. Danny looked between us with an expression I didn't know how to read then. "Did you two just become friends without me?" he said. Julian stood, rinsed his mug, and touched his son briefly on the shoulder, the complicated love between them present even in that small gesture. "Your friend is interesting," he said simply, and then he went back to his half-finished chair and the afternoon went on. But something had shifted. Something had been laid quietly like a first stone in a foundation. I didn't name it. I wasn't ready to name it. But I felt it in the way you feel the beginning of a season change, not in a single day, but in the quality of the light. Over the following months, I found reasons to be at that house on Elmwood Avenue. I told myself they were Danny's reasons: study sessions, football Sundays, help moving a new mattress up the narrow staircase. And some of them genuinely were. But I also began to notice that I felt a particular kind of calm descending on me when I turned onto that street, when the blue door appeared between the maple trees. A feeling I didn't entirely understand and was not ready to examine. Julian was always there in the background of those visits, present without imposing. He would bring out a plate of food without being asked, slide it onto the coffee table beside us without interrupting the conversation, and retreat back to his workshop or his reading chair. But sometimes he would stay lean against the doorframe and listen to Danny and I debate something ridiculous, and occasionally offer a single, quiet observation that dismantled both our arguments with surgical precision, and then simply walk away. I started looking for those moments, waiting for them. I started noticing everything. The way he took his glasses off when he was thinking hard about something and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The way he laughed, rare but full, a laugh that seemed to surprise even him. The books he was reading, their titles. The way he'd sometimes leave them face down and open on the arm of his chair, as if the story were a conversation he'd stepped away from briefly and intended to return to. The playlist that always drifted faintly from the workshop: classic soul, some jazz, the occasional achingly beautiful folk song. I noticed all of it with the careful, helpless attention of someone who is trying very hard not to notice. And I was 22. He was 47. He was my best friend's father. He was a man who had buried a wife, Danny's mother, Alina, who had passed from cancer 6 years earlier, and whose absence was present in the house in the particular way of someone deeply loved and deeply missed. A photograph on the mantel, a garden in the backyard she had planted that Julian still tended every spring. He was a man whose entire life was built and settled and real in ways mine was not yet. And I was nobody's idea of a love story for him. I was the young, nervous, funny kid who wore mismatched socks and talked too fast when he was anxious and had never in his entire life successfully communicated something important to someone he cared about. I told myself all of this regularly, like a recitation, like a wall I was building one brick at a time. And then the night of the thunderstorm came, and I discovered that some walls are not built to last. It was late November. Danny had gone to visit his cousin in Portland for the long Thanksgiving weekend, and I had declined the invitation. My mother was visiting, and I had planned to spend the days with her. But my mother's visit ended a day early, her knee acting up again, and I found myself alone in my apartment with a silence that felt different from solitude. It felt like loneliness with its coat off. I drove without fully deciding to drive. I found myself on Elmwood Avenue. I sat in my car for 3 full minutes, having a firm conversation with myself about sensible decisions and appropriate boundaries, and the importance of not being the person who shows up uninvited at their best friend's father's house at 7 o'clock on a rainy November evening. And then I knocked on the blue door. Julian opened it. He was in reading glasses this time, a book in one hand, and the warm light from inside the house spilled out around him like something from a painting. He looked at me. He looked at the rain on my shoulders. He looked at my face, really looked in that way he had, and simply stepped aside. "Come in, Liam," he said. "I'll make tea." I sat at that kitchen counter again while rain lashed against the windows and the record player turned in the living room, and Julian made chamomile tea with the focused quiet of someone who understood that some silences needed company rather than filling. He set the mug in front of me. He sat across from me, and he waited. "I don't know why I'm here," I said finally, which was the most honest thing I had said out loud in months. He considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Sometimes the place we need to be finds us before we understand why," he said. "That's not irrational, that's intuition." I wrapped my hands around the mug. "Do you get lonely?" I asked, and then immediately, "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "Yes," he said simply, no performance of it, no drama, just the quiet, clean honesty of a man who had long since made peace with difficult truths. "Especially in weather like this. Elena loved storms." He glanced toward the window. "She used to bring a blanket out to the porch and just sit in them." The tenderness in his voice when he said her name was so complete, so unguarded, that I felt it like a physical thing. "She sounds incredible," I said softly. "She was," he paused. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for people who performed themselves, and you don't." He looked at me steadily. "You try to sometimes, but you don't quite manage it." I stared at him. "Is that an insult?" I asked. The corner of his mouth curved. "It's the opposite." And there it was, that moment, small and devastating, where something I had been carefully not nomming looked directly at me from across a kitchen counter, in the middle of a November storm, over 2 cups of chamomile tea. I drove home 2 hours later with my heart doing something irregular, and my hands not quite steady on the wheel. And I thought, this is a problem. And I thought you knew this was coming. And I thought very quietly in the part of myself where all the true things live, I am in love with him. The question was no longer whether it was true. The question was what I was going to do with a truth that had the power to break everything I valued, and whether the bravest thing I could do was hold it silently or let it speak. The most terrifying thing about real love is that it sees you and keeps looking. December arrived the way it always does in the Pacific Northwest, not with fanfare but with a deepening, a drawing in, a slow compression of daylight until the world felt like it was breathing through a narrower opening. The city put up its lights and the streets turned gold and cold, and I walked through all of it feeling like a man living 2 lives simultaneously. The outer one, loud and functional and adequately convincing, and the inner one, quiet and consuming, organized entirely around a feeling I had no right to have and no ability to release. I want to be honest with you about this part, because I think honesty is what a story like this owes you. I was not proud of what I felt. I was not comfortable in it or excited by it the way you might imagine. What I felt in those weeks of December was mostly a profound and exhausting confusion. Because loving someone is never purely simple, but loving someone who exists in your life in the specific sacred role that Julian existed in mine felt, at its worst moments, like a betrayal. Danny was my best friend, my actual truest, most consistent friend, the person who had shown up for me in college when my mother got sick and I couldn't afford to fly home, the person who had sat with me in the hospital waiting room and held my coffee and not said a single meaningless thing for 3 hours, and somehow that had been the most loving gesture anyone had ever offered me. Danny's trust was not a small thing. Danny's friendship was not incidental. And his father was, I kept coming back to it, kept pressing on it like a bruise. His father was a man with a whole life behind him, a man who had loved deeply and lost deeply and built himself back up from that loss into something quiet and strong. He was not a man who needed a 22-year-old's messy, terrified, unnamed feelings complicating the peace he had constructed. So I made a decision. I made what I believed at the time to be the mature and generous and loving decision. I would say nothing. I would be Julian's friend because he had become that genuinely in the months of conversation and kitchen counters and late evenings. I would be present and honest and real in our friendship, and I would take the rest of it and put it somewhere deep and sealed and quiet, and I would leave it there. This is, as it turns out, easier decided than done. The complication arrived in the form of a workshop. Julian had mentioned once that he was taking on a larger commission, a full dining set for a family in the hills, 8 chairs and a table, all in white oak. He said it offhandedly, the way he said most things, but I heard in it something that I recognized as quiet pride, and I'd asked a question and he'd answered it. and we'd spent 20 minutes talking about joinery and grain direction and the philosophy of furniture making as a form of honest labor. 2 weeks later, Danny mentioned that his dad had asked, casually with plausible deniability, whether I'd want to come see the workshop sometime. I said yes before Danny had finished the sentence. The workshop was in the detached garage behind the house, and Julian had transformed it with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. The walls were pegboard hung with tools arranged with almost architectural precision. The air smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and something faintly mineral. Half-finished pieces stood on work tables, and there was a quality of purposeful silence in the space that I recognized instantly. It was the silence of someone's most private thinking, made physical. He showed me the dining table in progress. It was extraordinary. The wood itself seemed to have something to say, the grain running in long, contemplative lines, and Julian's hands moved across the surface as he spoke about it the way my hands moved over blueprints. Like the thing was already speaking and he was just learning to listen to it. "Can I help?" I asked, and then, self-conscious, "I mean, I've never done this, I'd probably ruin something." He handed me a piece of sandpaper and a sanding block without hesitation. "You won't. Follow the grain, don't rush it, pay attention to what the wood is telling you." We worked side by side for 2 hours that evening. The record player played from a small Bluetooth speaker, Sam Cooke, then Joni Mitchell, then something I didn't recognize, something low and aching and gorgeous. We talked sometimes and were quiet other times, and I discovered something about myself that evening that felt like genuine revelation. I was completely, utterly at peace, not performing ease, not manufacturing calm, not filling silence with noise to protect myself, just present. Inside my own skin. In a workshop that smelled of white oak and linseed oil beside a man I had no business loving, more at home than I had felt in years. When I finally left, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Julian walked me to the door as he always did, and I stepped out onto the porch, and the night was clear and cold, and the stars were the kind of extravagant that only happens when the sky scrubs itself clean of clouds. "Thank you," I said, "for this." He looked at me with those river-brown eyes. "Thank you for the company," he said, and then, carefully, "You have good hands, Liam, patient ones, that's rare." I drove home with his words sitting in my chest like something warm and irreversible. The wall, I noticed, was not holding. Christmas came and went. I spent it with my mother, who had driven up to stay for the week, who watched me with the quiet X-ray attention of mothers everywhere and said, on the second evening, "There's someone, isn't there?" I told her it was complicated. She said that was always what people said when the answer was yes, but the situation was frightening. I told her she was impossible. She agreed cheerfully and poured us both more wine. New Year's was a party at Danny's apartment, crowded and warm and full of people I liked. Julian didn't come. He never came to the parties. That wasn't his world, but sometime around 11 o'clock my phone lit up with a message. "Happy New Year, Liam. I hope 2024 is a good year for you. You deserve a good one. Jay." I read it 4 times. I stood in a corner of Danny's living room while the party swelled around me, and I read a text message 4 times like it was encoded with something I had not yet decoded. And maybe it was, or maybe I was a 22-year-old making meaning out of nothing, projecting a whole emotional architecture onto a polite New Year's text from a man who was simply kind to people, because that was the kind of man he was. I wrote back, "Happy New Year, thank you, I hope you're okay tonight." And then, before I could stop myself, "Some years I think about the people spending New Year's alone, and I hope they know they're not forgotten." The response came 3 minutes later. "They appreciate that more than you know." I put my phone in my pocket and went and found Danny and let the noise of the party cover the sound of everything happening quietly inside me. January brought a complication I had not anticipated. Julian began to pull back. It was subtle, everything with him was subtle, but I knew the texture of his presence well enough by then to feel its alteration. He was present but slightly more formal, slightly more careful with the architecture of our interactions, less likely to stay in the kitchen and talk, more likely to disappear into the workshop when I arrived. I told myself this was appropriate. I told myself this was a man being a responsible adult, maintaining a healthy distance from his adult son's 22-year-old friend. I told myself that nothing had happened, that this was simply the natural rhythm of acquaintance. But I also know, because I have had enough time now to look back with clear eyes, that something had been shifting between us for months, and that Julian, who was perceptive in the deep, unhurried way of people who observe more than they speak, had felt it too. And it had frightened him. Not in the dramatic, sharp way of a man confronting something immoral, but in the slow, aching way of a man who has put his heart somewhere very safe and very still, and who feels it beginning, inexplicably, to move again. We danced around each other for 3 weeks. It was elegant and painful and exhausting. And then February arrived, and Danny, good, oblivious, chaotic Danny, did something that neither of us had asked for and both of us needed. "I need a favor," Danny said, dropping onto my couch one Thursday evening with the energy of someone who has already decided the answer is yes and is merely informing you of this. "Dad's got this thing, the dining set delivery, the big one, and he needs help moving it. I'm supposed to help him Saturday, but I have to go to this work thing. It's non-negotiable. Liam, don't make that face." "What face?" "The face you make when I'm about to ask you something inconvenient." "What face is that?" "The perfectly neutral one. It's very suspicious." He pressed his hands together. "Would you help him, please? He won't ask anyone else and he won't hire movers because you know how he is." I did know how he was. Julian had a precise and deeply held belief that if you built a thing with your own hands, you owed it the dignity of delivering it yourself. "Of course," I said, which was the only thing I was ever going to say. We drove to the delivery address in Julian's truck on a pale Saturday morning, the dining set carefully wrapped in moving blankets in the bed. The family wasn't home until noon, so we had 2 hours to spare, and Julian, in a move I would later understand was not entirely accidental, suggested breakfast at a diner on the highway. We sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth with coffee and eggs and the particular intimacy of two people who have made a silent, mutual, very fragile decision to be honest. It started with nothing, with the weather, with the dining set and the challenges of white oak in cold temperatures, with his plans to take on an apprentice in the spring, a local kid who'd shown up at his workshop door on a dare from friends and stayed for 3 months asking questions. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, Julian set down his coffee cup and said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," I said. "Are you happy, Liam?" The question landed with the weight of something much larger than its 6 words. I looked at him. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, open, a little uncertain, younger than his usual self somehow, braced. "I'm getting there," I said carefully. I've been figuring some things out about myself, about what I want." He nodded, looked at his coffee. "I ask because," he stopped, started again. "I spent a long time after Alina making myself very small, very quiet. I thought that was the respectful thing, the right thing." A pause. "I'm not sure it was anymore." The diner hummed around us, silverware on ceramic, the low murmur of other people's mornings. "What changed?" I asked. My voice was very even. I was very focused on keeping it very even. He looked up at me, and in his eyes there was something I recognized because I had been carrying its mirror image for months. "I'm not sure I should answer that," he said softly. And that was the moment. That was the cliff edge. That was 2 people standing in the full, terrifying awareness of something real between them, both of them too careful and too scared and too decent to take the next step, and both of them knowing with absolute certainty that the next step was coming. We delivered the dining set. The family was delighted. Julian ran his hand along the tabletop one last time, quietly, a private goodbye to something he'd made. I watched him do it and understood something about the depth of him that I hadn't had language for before. We drove home mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than before, charged and honest and full of everything neither of us had said in that red vinyl booth. When we pulled up to the blue door, we both sat in the truck for a moment longer than necessary. "Julian," I said. "Liam," he said at exactly the same moment. We both stopped. A startled, impossible laugh moved between us, quiet, sudden, unplanned. "You go," I said. "No," he said, "you." I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me, and I said very quietly, with all the courage I had been assembling for months, "I think you know what I was going to say." He was quiet for a long, suspended moment. His hands rested in his lap. "I think I do," he said finally, "and I think I need you to know that another stop, a breath. I need some time to think, not because I don't know what I feel, but because what I feel is significant, Liam, and I want to handle it with the seriousness it deserves." I nodded. My heart was a tremendous, reckless noise in my chest. "Okay," I said, "I understand." I got out of the truck. I walked to my car. I sat in it without starting it for a full 5 minutes. And then my phone buzzed. "Liam, I want to have the conversation. Just give me a few days and then come back." I read it. I pressed my hand flat against the center of my chest, against the reckless noise. I'll be here, I wrote back. I'll always be here. But between a promise and its fulfillment, life has a terrible habit of inserting complications. And what neither of us knew yet, what was waiting, patient, and inevitable in the days ahead, was that before Julian and I could find our way to each other, we would first have to survive the person whose love mattered most to both of us finding out exactly what was happening. And Danny was about to come home. Love doesn't ask permission, it only asks that you be honest about it. There are moments in life that have a before and an after. You don't always know them when they're happening. Sometimes you don't recognize them until you're on the other side, looking back, seeing the clean line drawn across the timeline of your life. But sometimes you feel them as they arrive, like a change in air pressure, like the silence before weather. The morning Danny came home from Portland, I felt it, something tightening in the atmosphere, something inevitable and approaching. He came to my apartment first, which was unusual. He had a key, most best friends do, eventually, and he let himself in while I was making coffee, dropping his bag in the hallway and appearing in my kitchen doorway with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not angry, not upset, something more uncertain than that, something that was trying to figure out what it was allowed to be. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said, "you're back early." "Yeah," he sat down at my kitchen table, he looked at his hands. "I got a text last night from my dad." The kitchen went very still. "Oh," I kept my voice level, poured a second mug of coffee, set it in front of him. "He didn't say much." Danny wrapped both hands around the mug. "Just he said there was something he wanted to talk to me about, something important, about," he looked up. His eyes met mine with an uncomfortable directness. "About someone he'd been spending time with." The silence that followed was the loudest I've ever experienced. I sat down across from him because I owed him that. Not distance, not deflection, not my usual arsenal of humor and misdirection. I owed him the same table and I owed him my eyes on his. "Danny," I said. He looked at me, he waited. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to hear me out before you respond, all of it, because you deserve the whole truth, not just the frightening first part." Something moved across his face, a flash of emotion, quickly mastered. He nodded once. So I told him all of it, from the blue door in September to the kitchen and the chamomile tea and the workshop and the diner booth and the truck outside the house. I told him about the months of silence, of telling myself no, of building walls. I told him about the depth of it, not the surface, not the infatuation, but the thing underneath. The thing that had been built slowly, conversation by conversation, winter afternoon by winter afternoon, in the particular way that real things are built. Without planning, without performance, from raw material that two people bring to each other without realizing what they're making. I told him that I had never for a single moment not thought about him, about what it meant for our friendship, about what it would cost him if it cost him anything. I told him that he was the most important person in my life aside from my mother, that his friendship was not collateral damage I was willing to accept, that if he needed me to walk away from his father, from the possibility of something I had never wanted anything more in my life, I would do it. Because I knew how to love people with my whole self, and sometimes that meant absorbing the cost so they didn't have to. I finished talking, my coffee was cold, my hands were steady, my heart was very, very loud. Danny was quiet for a long time. I want to tell you what happened in that silence because I think it's the most important part of this story. More important than the romance, even. Because what happened in my kitchen that morning was something extraordinary disguised as something ordinary, a friendship being tested at its absolute depth and deciding deliberately not to break. Danny is not a person who processes things quickly or quietly. He's a person who needs to move, to talk, to fill space with noise. But that morning, for the first time since I'd known him, he was entirely still. He looked at the table, he looked at his coffee, he looked at me. And then he said, "How long have you been carrying this?" I blinked, of all the things I'd prepared for. "Since September," I said, "more or less." He nodded slowly. Something worked its way across his face, not what I'd expected. Not anger, not betrayal, something more complicated. Something that looked, if I was reading it right, like grief that was trying to make room for something else. "My dad," he said quietly, he's been different this year, I noticed it, I just didn't know what it was. He seems," he searched for the word, "lighter, like something loosened in him." He looked at me directly. "That's you, isn't it?" I didn't answer, I didn't need to. Danny set down his coffee, stood up, walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the gray February street for a long, long moment. "I'm not angry," he said finally, and it sounded like he'd arrived at the words after a real journey through other possible words. "I want to be, maybe. Some part of me thought I wanted to be, because it's strange, Liam, it's really strange. He's my father and you're my best friend and the whole thing is strange," I offered quietly. "Monumentally strange," he agreed, then a silence. "But he hasn't been happy, not really happy, not for a long time. Since before Mom died, even in some ways they were happy together, really happy, but he always held the deepest part of himself back, even from her. She used to say so. She used to say he kept a room in himself that nobody had the key to." He paused. "When I talk to him now, the last few months, something's different. He asks me how I'm doing, like he actually wants to know, not because it's the parent thing to do. He told me last month he'd been thinking about what he wants. He used those words, what he wants." He turned to look at me. "My dad doesn't talk like that, hasn't in years." Something in my chest was pulling so tight it almost hurt. "Danny." "I'm not done," he said, not unkindly. He came back to the table and sat down. "I love my dad and I love you, and I'm not going to pretend I don't need time to get my head around this, because I do. But I also," his jaw worked, "I also know what it looks like when something is real. My mom used to say that real love doesn't make the people around it smaller, it makes everyone bigger." He looked at me for a moment. "You've been a better friend to me this year than most. You haven't let this make me smaller." "I never would," I said. My voice had gone rough at the edges. "I know," he said simply, and then, "Go talk to him, Liam. Go have the conversation you've both been circling for 3 months. He picked up his coffee again. "And then come back and explain to me how this is going to work, because I still need a best friend, and apparently I also need to renegotiate the definition of family." I laughed, a broken, relieved, overwhelmed laugh, and Danny shook his head and laughed too, and for a moment it was just us, the way it had always been us, and the strangeness of the situation was present, but it was not the whole truth. It was not larger than what we were to each other. "Thank you," I said. "It wasn't enough. It was everything I had." "Buy me lunch sometime," he said. "Something nice, I've earned it." I drove to Elmwood Avenue that afternoon. The maple trees were bare now, February stark, their architecture exposed, and I thought, as I always thought about this street, that there was an honesty to winter trees that summer trees don't have. Something about the absence of embellishment, something about seeing the structure without the decoration. I parked, I sat for a moment. I thought about the boy I'd been when I first knocked on this door, 22 and lonely and funny and frightened of everything that truly mattered. I thought about the months that had passed and what they'd made of me, quietly and without my permission. More patient, more present, more willing to sit in the difficulty of real things rather than paper over them with noise. I thought about Julian, about his hands on the wood, about his voice saying, "You have good hands, patient ones, that's rare," about his face in the diner booth, open and braced and younger than himself, about that text message, "I want to have the conversation." I got out of the car, I walked to the blue door, I knocked. It took a moment, I heard footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, the door opened. Julian stood in the light, he looked at me. Something in his expression shifted, relief, I thought, the particular relief of something you've been waiting for finally arriving. "I talked to Danny," I said. He absorbed this, nodded slowly. "How did he?" "He was Danny," I said, which means it was complicated and honest and ultimately generous. A breath released from him, long and quiet. "Come in," he said. We went to the living room this time, not the kitchen. The record player was on, something slow and searching, a voice I didn't recognize over quiet guitar. He sat in his reading chair and I sat on the couch, and between us was the particular charged silence of two people who have run out of reasons to be careful. "I've been thinking," Julian said, "about what it means to be brave." I waited. "I was brave when Alina was dying," he said quietly. "That's a specific kind of courage, the kind that the situation demands of you whether you like it or not. You simply do what has to be done because the alternative is failing someone you love." He was quiet for a moment. "But this kind of brave, the kind where nothing is demanding it of you, where you could just as easily stay still and safe and nobody would blame you." He looked at me. I'd forgotten what this kind felt like. "What does it feel like?" I asked. "Terrifying," he said, and then with the edge of that rare, full smile, "and completely necessary." I looked at him across the room. The winter light from the windows fell soft and level, the way afternoon light does in February, no drama to it, just an honest illumination. He was 50 years of a real and complicated life. He was patient hands and river-brown eyes and a voice that lived in a room of its own. He was a man who had loved and lost and built himself back up, and still, under all of it, had that locked room in himself, the one his wife had spoken of. The one that nobody had found the key to. I'm in love with you, I said, simply, clearly, without decoration. I have been for months. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give, but I needed you to hear it as a clean sentence. Julian was very still. I know, he said softly. I know you are. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, looking at the space between us. Can I tell you something about the room I keep in myself, the one Danny probably told you about that Alina talked about? She told Danny about it, I said carefully. He told me. He nodded. I've kept that room locked since I was very young. I locked it so long ago I almost forgot why. I think he paused. I think I've known in the very back of myself for a very long time something about who I am and who I'm capable of loving that I was too frightened and too bound to circumstance and to other people's ideas of me to look at directly. He raised his eyes to mine. And then you knocked on my door with your mismatched socks and your architectural theories about the emotional meaning of porches, and you sat at my kitchen counter and listened to me the way nobody has listened to me in years, and that room, his voice was quiet and steady and full of something vast. That room started to have light under the door again. The music moved through the room. Outside, the February light was gold and cold against the bare maples. Julian, I said. I'm 60 days from 48 years old, he said with a directness that acknowledged everything. You are 22. I'm your best friend's father. I'm a man with a workshop and reading glasses and a complicated grief and the specific emotional vocabulary of someone who learned to love quietly in the margins. He looked at me steadily. Tell me you understand what you'd be choosing. I understand it exactly, I said. I've understood it for months, and I'm choosing it with full information. He held my gaze for a long, suspended moment. I'm in love with you too, he said. I have been for longer than I know how to explain, and I'm frightened, Liam. I want to say that plainly. I am genuinely frightened. A pause. But I am also, he looked down at his hands, then back up. I am also done being afraid of the things worth being brave about. He stood. I stood. We met in the middle of that room, between his chair and my couch in the low February light, and there was a moment, suspended and shining and weightless, where we simply looked at each other. Completely seen, completely known. No wall between us, no careful architecture, no locked room. He reached out and took my hand. Just that, his hand closing around mine, his thumb against my knuckles, his grip steady and sure and full of everything he just said. I breathed. I felt the trembling in me go quiet, the way a compass needle settles after a long time spinning. Hi, he said softly. Hi, I said. And we both, at exactly the same moment, began to laugh quietly, helplessly, the laugh of two people who have been through something enormous and arrived somewhere they couldn't quite believe was real. And it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever been part of. What followed was not simple. I want to be honest about that because this is an honest story. There were difficult conversations, with Danny again and again, as he processed and adjusted and renegotiated, as he found humor in the situation and then real acceptance, and then something that with time began to look like genuine warmth. There were awkward dinners in the early months where nobody quite knew how to arrange themselves at the table, where old dynamics and new ones overlapped like transparencies that hadn't yet resolved into a single image. There were moments when Julian's age and mine created real asymmetries, not in love, not in depth of feeling, but in practical life, in different reference points and different rhythms and different relationships with the future. We talked about all of it. Sometimes uncomfortably, always honestly. There were also people in the wider world who had opinions. Julian's colleagues who raised eyebrows, old friends who needed time, strangers who felt entitled to do the math in public. We navigated all of it together, and sometimes navigating it was hard. But here is what was also true. It was the realest thing I had ever been inside of. It was a love built from scratch, conversation by conversation, in kitchens and workshops and truck cabs and red vinyl diners and slow winter afternoons. It was a love between two people who had chosen each other with full information about all the difficulty, who had looked at the ledger of complexity, and decided the thing on the other side of it was worth any cost. It is now 3 years since that February afternoon. I am 25. Julian is 50. We live in the house on Elmwood Avenue, the one with the blue door, the maples, the record player, the workshop where we still sometimes work side by side on Saturday mornings, the garden that Alina planted and that we tend every spring together, the kitchen where 2 mugs of chamomile tea and a November thunderstorm started something that had no name and became everything. Danny is our best man. Not a metaphor, an actual best man, because we are engaged to be married in September, and Danny stood in the workshop 3 months ago while Julian and I fumbled through asking him, and he said finally in a tone of such theatrical exasperation that all 3 of us ended up on the floor laughing. And when we finally stopped laughing, there were tears on his face, and he didn't bother to explain them because we all knew what they were. My mother came for dinner last month. She sat across from Julian at the dining table, white oak, a Mercer original, the first piece he ever made, while I stood beside him with sandpaper, and they talked for 4 hours about books and grief and the emotional architecture of rooms. When she hugged me goodbye at the door, she held on an extra moment. "He sees you," she whispered. "He actually sees you." I think about that boy sometimes, the one who stood on this porch the first time with mismatched socks and a six-pack of soda and a loneliness he'd been carrying for so long he'd stopped feeling its weight. I think about all the walls he built and all the careful architecture of his own not wanting, all the good and devoted reasons he assembled for why this wasn't allowed to be real. And I think about what I would tell him if I could step back across those years and find him on this porch in the September gold before the door opened. I would say the bravest thing is not the dramatic thing. The bravest thing is the quiet thing. It's sitting across a kitchen counter from someone who sees you and letting them see you back. It's saying the true sentence when the true sentence is frightening. It's not performing smallness to make a love story tidier or more explicable to people who haven't felt it. Some love stories don't fit the expected shape. That doesn't make them lesser, that makes them yours. I would say knock on the door, drink the tea, stay. The blue door is behind me now as I write this. The maples are changing again. I can see them from the window of the study we made from what used to be Julian's spare room, my drafting table beside his reading chair, his books and my blueprints sharing the shelves in a logic that is entirely our own. Downstairs, I can hear the record player. I can hear Julian in the kitchen, the quiet percussion of dinner being made, the unhurried movements of a man fully inside his own life. In a moment, I'll go down. I'll lean against the counter and he'll hand me something to stir, and he'll say something that requires me to think for a second before responding, and I'll respond, and the night will settle around us like a house that knows its people. But first, I sit here and I think about love, about what it costs and what it gives, about the life-changing moments that don't announce themselves, that arrive in blue doors and chamomile tea and two people in a diner booth with their hands around coffee cups and all their best reasons to stay silent, finally failing them. About how the slow burn is the true burn. About how a heartfelt connection built carefully over time from real material by two people willing to be honest in the hardest moments is the only kind of connection worth having. About how everything I thought I needed to protect myself from was, in fact, the direction of my entire life. About a room with light under the door and two people brave enough to open it. And if you're out there holding something true and frightening in both hands, not sure if you're allowed to say it, this story is for you. You're allowed. You were always allowed.